At 0530 hours local time on the 13th of August, 2026, 5 Ukrainian Palianytsia jet-powered UAVs were racing toward Russian airspace over the Black Sea. Their targets were key warships of Russia's Black Sea Fleet at the Novorossiysk naval base. An S-400 battery positioned near the Sukko coastline, Russia's most advanced air defense system, immediately moved to intercept them. To the Russian officers watching their screens, it looked like another routine firing exercise, no different from the interceptions carried out every day. But they still had no idea that hidden behind those jet-powered UAVs was one of the most devastating coordinated multi-stage attacks Ukraine had ever launched. It was a strike package designed to create chaos, exhaust defensive firepower, and penetrate every layer of defense, separating the Odessa coastline from Russia's Admiral-class frigates anchored in the harbor. Ukraine's Palianytsia jet-powered UAVs flew in a loose formation at an altitude of 220 feet above the waves. Their 12-foot-long airframes, powered by turbojet engines, tore through the salty air at 500 miles per hour. The jet-powered UAV was built from carbon fiber structural composite materials, weighed 650 pounds, and carried a 220-pound high-explosive warhead. But on the radar screen, its radar return profile appeared almost like a seagull searching for food. 35 miles inland from the coastline, northeast of the S-400 air defense battery, Russia's 91N-6E Big Bird target acquisition radar swept across the southeastern horizon while the operators watched strange, illogical returns appear on their displays. In theory, the phased array antenna could simultaneously track 300 targets at ranges of up to 380 miles under favorable conditions against cooperative targets flying within its designed altitude envelope. But these targets were not predictable. The officer saw ghosts, flickering contacts appearing inside the clutter, showing up for 2 scans, disappearing for 3, then reappearing each time on a slightly different heading. Something was out there. The velocity data proved it, but the system could not determine exactly what it was. The detection problem was not the radar. The detection problem was physics. At an altitude of 220 feet above the water, the curvature of the Earth created a shadow zone that no ground-based radar could see through. The 91N-6E system was positioned on a truck-mounted platform roughly 30 feet above the coastline. Basic geometry limited direct line-of-sight detection of sea-skimming targets to only around 20 miles. The S-400's designed effective range of 250 miles assumed a fighter flying at 28,000 feet, not small RCS jet-powered UAVs skimming just above the sea where the radar beam could not reach. Ukraine's drone designers understood this geometry and built a UAV specifically to exploit it. Ukrainian military planners designed it around a unique combination of compact size, ultra-low terrain-following flight capability, and a jam-resistant navigation system to neutralize the advantage of the renowned S-400 Triumph air defense system. But this is where it becomes even more interesting. The Palianytsia jet UAV's airframe was constructed from carbon fiber composite materials combined with lightweight metal alloys, allowing the UAV to minimize its dry weight so it could carry more fuel and a larger warhead while also helping to reduce its radar cross-section, or RCS, increasing its stealth against enemy air defense networks. At 0543 hours local time, the Palianytsias crossed the 20-mile detection threshold. The S-400 Triumph's Big Bird radar finally achieved a stable classification on the lead target. Current speed, 480 miles per hour. Altitude, 210 feet above the sea. Approaching from the 8 o'clock direction, heading directly toward Novorossiysk naval base, now 20 miles away, consistent with the profile of a lightweight cruise missile. The target information was immediately patched to an S-350 Vityaz battery positioned deeper inside the Novorossiysk defensive ring. But once the full trajectory of the Palianytsia group was plotted, the commander realized he had only 45 seconds to engage. The 50N-6A multifunction radar switched into tracking mode, continuously updating range, bearing, altitude, and velocity to generate a firing solution. Almost immediately, the radar detected 4 more high-speed targets behind them, and a cluster of smaller, slower signals that were far more numerous. The We-5 Palianytsias could clearly be only the opening layer intended to force Russian air defenses to expend ammunition. There was no time left for analysis. 9 M96 missiles were launched vertically in rapid succession. Their solid fuel motors quickly accelerated them to around Mach 3, while the 50N-6A transmitted mid-course corrections through a data link. In the terminal phase, the missile's radar seekers completed the interception solution. The lead Palianytsia continued flying low above the sea. When the distance closed to only about 30 feet, the proximity fuse triggered, creating a high-velocity fragmentation field that tore through the composite airframe and destroyed the UAV. About 30 seconds later, the second 9M96 destroyed the next one. 2 targets were down, but almost the entire 45-second engagement window had disappeared. The S-350 immediately requested S-400 support to shoot down the remaining 3 Palianytsias. The problem was that in a layered air defense network, sharing the same radar data did not mean every battery instantly had the same track ID. The S-400's 55K6E command post had to cross-check target codes, flight directions, and velocity data with the other units. Only a few seconds were lost to synchronization, but with jet-powered UAVs approaching at around 500 miles per hour, every second represented more than 730 feet of distance. When the next 2 Palianytsias crossed the roughly 17-mile threshold, the S-400 opened fire. Almost simultaneously, an S-350 battery within the same defensive network also received a firing solution. A total of 4 interceptors, 2 from the S-400 and 2 from the S-350, left their launchers within a few seconds. Because target allocation had not been fully completed, multiple interceptors converged on nearly identical tracks. This was a particularly dangerous form of overkill during a saturation attack. The radars were still functioning, but ready-to-fire missile stocks were being depleted faster than targets were being destroyed. The third Palianytsia was torn apart first. A few seconds later, the fourth also disappeared from the screen. Russia had destroyed 4 of the 5 UAVs, but had used a total of 6 surface-to-air missiles from 3 systems, the S-350, S-400, and S-300. More importantly, their engagement channels had just been occupied at exactly the moment a second cluster of targets was approaching. Reload vehicles began being called forward while the launchers that had just fired entered their reorganization and rearming cycle. That was the gap the final Palianytsia needed. While the flashes from the interceptions were still visible behind it, its jet engine was pushed to higher power, accelerating beyond 600 miles per hour. At that speed, the UAV could cover more than a mile in about 6 seconds. Ahead now lay only the Novorossiysk coastline, the harbor facilities, and the warships of the Black Sea Fleet. Inside the UAV, its roughly 220-pound high-explosive warhead was still intact. But the 5th Palianytsia was not even the greatest threat, because behind it, the slower and smaller cluster of signals that the 50N6A had detected earlier was beginning to separate from the background clutter, with each track appearing clearly on the tactical display one by one. The second wave had finally arrived. Less than 60 seconds after the first interception salvo, the Novorossiysk air defense network was forced to process a much denser tactical picture. Behind the final Palianytsia, radar began building 25 new tracks. 21 slower targets moving at 110 miles per hour showed the characteristics of propeller-driven UAVs, while 4 larger signals maintained high speed and converged on the naval base. This was no longer a single drone swarm, but a multi-layered attack. The 4 high-speed targets were quickly given priority. Data from the 50N6A radar showed that they produced stronger radar returns than the Palianytsias, maintained stable flight paths, and were not heading toward air defense positions, but directly toward the harbor area. The system classified them as 4 FP-5 Flamingo cruise missiles, the main strike layer positioned behind the opening formation. In this attack configuration, each Flamingo carried a 2,500-pound warhead, far larger than the explosive payloads of the UAVs ahead of them. With a stated range of 1,860 miles, a large airframe, and a fixed wingspan of around 23 feet, the FP-5 did not rely on absolute stealth. Its danger came from its large warhead, low-altitude flight profile, and the fact that it appeared just as Russian batteries had already expended interceptor missiles. A navigation system combining jam-resistant GNSS-INS and waypoint-based autopilot allowed the Flamingo to remain inside its flight corridor if satellite signals degraded. At 560 miles per hour, each missile closed the distance by nearly 800 feet every second. A delay of only 60 seconds in classification could allow the target to move almost 9 miles closer, rapidly shrinking the interception window. Behind them, the 21 FP-1s continued approaching from multiple offset angles. These UAVs were much slower, but they created pressure through sheer numbers. Radar still had to maintain tracks, Combat computers had to continuously update data, and fire control channels could not dedicate all their resources to the flamingos, including the surviving Palianytsia. The air defense network now had to track 26 incoming threats. Meanwhile, after the previous launch sequence, the main air defense units had only around 16 interceptors immediately available under the combat conditions of this scenario. Even under the ideal assumption of one missile for one target, the available ammunition was still lower than the number of tracks. In reality, firing 2 missiles at a high-value target or launching a follow-up interceptor after a failed engagement could reduce the remaining stock even faster. The priority problem was therefore obvious. The FP-1s were more numerous, but each flamingo carried a much larger warhead and was heading directly toward the warship anchorage. If firepower was divided too early against the UAV swarm, the 4 cruise missiles could penetrate deep into the harbor area. If everything was concentrated on the flamingos, the 21 FP-1s would continue forcing the inner defensive layers to fight with an increasingly depleted missile inventory. The 2 command posts reached almost the same decision: flamingos first, FP-1s later. The 4 high-speed tracks were elevated to the highest priority. The fire control radar shifted tracking resources. The combat computers continuously recalculated intercept points based on range, velocity, and approach angle, while the launchers moved their remaining ready missiles into the firing sequence. The launch tube covers snapped open. The first interceptor left the launcher, and the second followed less than a second later. Within about 5 seconds, multiple surface-to-air missiles from the S-400 and S-350 accelerated under solid fuel power, receiving mid-course corrections as they raced toward their predicted intercept points. But this time, the targets were no longer jet-powered UAVs sent ahead to open the way. In front of them were 4 flamingos carrying warheads weighing more than a ton. Behind them were 21 FP-1s, and every interceptor leaving its launcher meant the Novorossiysk defenses had 1 fewer missile available for whatever might appear next. The interception of the FP-5 flamingos had begun. The first intercept points appeared almost simultaneously. 2 interceptors entered the kill zone, and their proximity fuses triggered at a distance of 10 feet, releasing high-velocity fragmentation fields across the cruise missile airframes. 2 FP-5 flamingos disappeared from the screen within seconds. The next 2 interceptors missed their firing solutions. They detonated just behind the 2 flamingos that had already passed the predicted intercept points. The blast wave struck the missile airframes, forcing their wings sharply to one side, pushing their flight path several degrees off course and causing their altitude to drop briefly. But the autopilots reacted almost immediately. The INS detected the deviations. The flight control computers commanded corrections to the control surfaces, and within a few seconds the missiles returned to their flight corridors. There was no indication that the warheads had detonated or that the guidance systems had been lost. On the 50N6A screen, 2 tracks remained. The Air Defense Network assigned them the designations Enemy 13 and Enemy 08. Both continued racing toward Novorossiysk at 500 miles per hour. Their altitude remained low. Their trajectories continued converging on the harbor area, and their 2,500-pound warheads were still completely intact. They were still heading directly toward the Russian frigates. At 05:55 hours local time, deeper inside the Novorossiysk defensive ring, the S-300 battery began receiving the remainder of the strike package. After several scan cycles, the radar started building stable tracks on the slower group of targets. Their kinematic signatures matched the FP-1, fixed-wing UAVs powered by piston engines with low speed, limited acceleration, and radar cross-sections far smaller than those of the flamingos. Individually, they were not especially difficult targets for a long-range air defense system if the radar could maintain a stable track. But 21 of them at once created an entirely different problem. The problem was ammunition and the number of fire control channels immediately available. If the battery traded 1 interceptor for every FP-1, it could be forced to expend more than 20 missiles just to deal with the UAV layer behind. If some firing solutions failed, or if a high-priority target required 2 missiles to increase the probability of destruction, the number of interceptors required would rise even faster. Meanwhile, the S-300 could not ignore the 2 fastest symbols moving across the screen. Enemy 13 and Enemy 08 were closing the distance at 730 feet per second. Just 10 seconds of hesitation would allow them to move more than a mile closer to the warship anchorage. The FP-1 swarm was much slower, but it had been designed to continue flying in an unstable navigation environment. In the configuration used in this scenario, the flight computer combined GNSS with INS, gyroscopes, accelerometers, and a preloaded sequence of waypoints. As long as satellite data remained reliable, GNSS continuously corrected accumulated error. But if the signal began to degrade, the autopilot could still shift most of the task of maintaining course to the inertial system. That was when Russia's electronic warfare layer began to intervene. The Sukko 4 and other jamming elements within the EW network around Novorossiysk increased their activity, attempting to make the electromagnetic environment along the approach corridor increasingly difficult to use. On some FP1s, navigation data began showing deviations from the motion state being recorded by the INS. Several tracks drifted sideways by a few hundred feet. Some headings fluctuated across 2 or 3 updates. But what Russia was waiting for did not happen. The formation did not collapse, and most of the velocity vectors were still pointing toward Novorossiysk. The reason was time. INS still accumulated error, but that accumulation did not happen instantly. During the final stage of the flight, an FP1 did not need to know its position to the exact foot. It only needed to maintain its general heading long enough to keep pushing deeper into the target area. At 110 miles per hour, the swarm still covered nearly 1.8 miles every minute. 3 minutes of delay meant more than 5 miles. That meant the electronic warfare layer could reduce their accuracy, but it could not instantly remove 21 UAVs from the battle. The S-300 commander now had to make the choice that the entire attack appeared to have been designed to force upon him. Behind were 21 FP1s, numerous, slow, and stretching the available missile allocation. Ahead were Enemy 13 and Enemy 08, 4 times faster, each still carrying a warhead of around 2,500 pounds and racing directly toward the harbor. He chose the Flamingos. The 2 high-speed tracks were immediately elevated to the highest threat level. The fire control radar concentrated its tracking resources on them, continuously updating range, bearing, altitude, and closing speed. The combat computer did not aim the interceptor at the target's current position. Instead, it calculated a future meeting point where the trajectories of the surface-to-air missile and the Flamingo could intersect. Enemy 13 was assigned to an engagement channel first. Enemy 08 followed immediately afterward. Track data was smoothed across successive scans to reduce errors caused by the target's low-altitude flight, while the S-300 launchers moved their ready missiles into the firing sequence. During the same period, the 21 FP1s continued to be tracked but were not assigned interceptors. The Sukko 4 and other EW elements became the only layer attempting to reduce their accuracy, while the S-300 held its missiles for the 2 more dangerous targets. The final Palianytsia also remained inside the tracking network, adding another high-speed vector that the command post could not completely ignore. But the priority was still clear. If either Flamingo broke through, a warhead weighing more than a ton could cause far greater damage than a single UAV. The launchers received the final data. The firing solution on Enemy 13 stabilized first. A few seconds later, Enemy 08 also entered the engagement window. But every second the S-300 spent on the 2 Flamingos came at a price. In just 30 seconds, the FP1 swarm traveling at 110 miles per hour could move almost another mile without facing a single S-300 missile. That was the real value of the UAV layer behind them. They did not need to be faster than the radar, and they did not need to be more powerful than the surface-to-air missiles. They only needed to survive long enough to force Russia to decide which targets were worth shooting first. Enemy 13 and Enemy 08 finally sat fully inside the firing solution. The launch command was immediately transmitted to the launchers. 2 4-8N6 interceptor missiles left their launch tubes almost one after the other. Each missile was 24 feet long, weighed 4,000 pounds, carried a 315-pound high-explosive fragmentation warhead, and could reach speeds close to Mach 6. After launching vertically, their solid fuel motors pushed them above the trajectories of Enemy 13 and Enemy 08 before they dived toward intercept points continuously updated by the fire control computer, using range, bearing, altitude, and closing speed. During those few seconds, the 21 FP1s behind them continued moving forward by more than 500 feet without being engaged by a single surface-to-air missile. The first interceptor converged on Enemy 13 from above and slightly off the flank. When the distance closed into the lethal zone, the proximity fuse triggered the fragmentation warhead. A field of high-velocity fragments tore through the rear section of the Flamingo, damaging control surfaces, fuel lines, and part of the steering mechanism. The autopilot attempted to correct, but the missile body could no longer respond in a stable manner. Enemy 13 rolled sharply, lost altitude, and crashed into the Black Sea before reaching the harbor area. The second 4-8N6 approached Enemy 08 with less favorable geometry. The warhead detonated slightly behind the target, damaging part of the wing, reducing speed, and pushing the flight path several degrees off course. However, the roughly 2,500-pound warhead did not detonate. The engine remained operational, and the INS still maintained motion data. The autopilot began correcting the deviation step by step, pulling the Flamingo back toward its waypoint corridor. On the S-300 screen, Enemy 13 disappeared, but Enemy 08 remained as a track. 2 interceptors had been used, but only 1 Flamingo had been completely eliminated. The situation immediately became more difficult. Enemy 08 was still heading toward the harbor. The final Palianytsia remained alive on another vector while 21 FP-1s continued closing in at around 110 miles per hour. Under the scenario conditions, after repeated launches by the S-350, S-400, and S-300, the medium and long-range air defense layer around Novorossiysk had only about 10 interceptors immediately ready for use. The number of remaining targets was more than twice the available missile stock, meaning Russia no longer had the ability to destroy all of them with long-range missiles. The S-300 was forced to hold part of its interceptor supply for Enemy 08 and shift the UAV engagement mission to the closer defensive layer. The 4 lead FP-1s with the most stable tracks were selected. 4 missiles were launched toward 4 separate intercept points, and all 4 UAVs were destroyed. The number of FP-1s fell from 21 to 17, but the S-300 had also just expended 4 more interceptors. The commander immediately stopped using the S-300 to hunt the entire UAV swarm. As the remaining 17 FP-1s pushed deeper in, a Panzer S-1 battery near the harbor began receiving targets. The system carried up to 12 5.7E6 missiles on a single combat vehicle, each with an engagement range of around 12 miles and a high-explosive fragmentation warhead weighing roughly 44 pounds. In a rapid firing sequence, the Panzer launched 8 missiles at 8 different FP-1s and destroyed all 8. Combined with the S-300 salvo, 12 of the 21 FP-1s had been destroyed, leaving only 9 still advancing. But just as the Panzer prepared to fire again, Enemy 08 stabilized. Its INS and autopilot had corrected most of the deviation caused by the earlier proximity blast, and its velocity vector once again pointed directly toward the harbor area. At around 500 miles per hour, the Flamingo traveled more than 730 feet per second, meaning only 30 seconds of delay would allow it to move more than 4 miles closer. The S-300 immediately stopped assigning additional missiles to the FP-1s and shifted its radar back toward Enemy 08. The Panzer was also ordered to preserve its remaining 57 E-6 missiles. The 9 FP-1s were therefore handed over to the Panzer S-1's twin 30mm 2A38M automatic cannons. Each gun had a rate of fire of around 2,500 rounds per minute, producing a combined firing density of 5,000 rounds per minute when both opened fire together. The radar and electro-optical system began bringing each UAV into the close-range gun envelope instead of continuing to trade surface-to-air missiles for low-cost targets. This was when the logic of the strike package became clear. The Palianytsias forced the S-350 and S-400 to fire early. The Flamingos forced the S-300 to hold and expend 4 8N6 missiles. The FP-1S continued dragging the S-300 and Panzer into an ammunition battle. Against the FP-1 layer alone, Russia had already used 12 missiles to destroy 12 UAVs. The air defense network was still achieving a high kill rate, but ready ammunition was being depleted faster than it could be replenished. Ukraine did not necessarily need to destroy the radars or launchers. It only needed to force the air defense network to fire faster than missiles could be replaced. While the Panzer switched to its 30mm cannons to deal with the 9 remaining FP-1s, Enemy 08 continued racing toward Novorossiysk with its 2,500-pound warhead still intact. Russia had destroyed most of the opening layers, but after the long sequence of interceptors already expended, only one critical question remained. Did it still have enough ammunition and enough time to stop the final Flamingo before it reached the harbor? Red tracer streams cut across the path of the 9 remaining FP-1s. The Panzer S-1's twin 30mm 2A38M cannons continuously updated their firing solutions and placed fire ahead of the UAV's trajectories. The 3 lead drones were successively crippled in the wing, engine, and tail section, then fell into the sea. But on the radar screen, a more dangerous symbol kept advancing. Enemy 08. The FP-5 Flamingo had already taken heavy damage from the earlier interceptions, but its 2,500-pound warhead was still intact. The engine was still running, and the control system was still capable of keeping it pointed toward Novorossiysk. Its flight path was no longer fully stable. The missile kept banking slightly and drifting away from its waypoint before the autopilot pulled it back. In a GNSS-jammed environment, the navigation system reduced its reliance on satellite signals and depended more heavily on INS, gyroscopes, and accelerometers. The error continued to accumulate, but at this point the Flamingo no longer needed absolute precision. Ahead of it lay the entire military harbor area, with multiple warships concentrated within a relatively narrow space. Enemy 08 was closing at more than 730 feet per second when the distance fell to only a few thousand yards. The interception task began shifting from the shore-based batteries to the point defense systems of the warships inside the harbor. The 6-barrel 30mm AK-630M guns immediately turned toward the most dangerous approach axes. At that moment, there were still 8 targets in the area, 6 FP-1s, the final Palianytsia, and enemy 08. They were not approaching from the same direction, forcing the defensive systems to keep switching tracks. 2 FP-1s were shot down by AK-630M fire near the harbor entrance. But in those few seconds, the Flamingo had already moved forward by thousands of feet. Another FP-1 slipped into a gap between the harbor structures and was destroyed by an Igla missile at close range. But dealing with the slower UAVs continued to consume precious seconds. The shipboard warning systems immediately shifted attention to enemy 08. One AK-630M abandoned its FP-1 target and turned directly toward the Flamingo. The first burst of 30mm fire swept across the front of the missile. Several rounds punched into the rear fuselage, causing its trajectory to oscillate more violently. The autopilot kept correcting roll angle, but at this distance, it no longer needed a full recovery. It only needed to keep the nose pointed toward the harbor area for a few more seconds. The distance fell below 1,000 yards. The AK-630M kept firing. Enemy 08 banked right, dipped its nose, then pulled up again. There was no longer enough time to organize another interception cycle. In the simulated outcome of the scenario, the Flamingo crossed the edge of the pier area and slammed into the vicinity of the frigate Admiral-class. Its roughly 2,500-pound warhead detonated after impact, causing severe damage around the point of strike, disrupting part of the electrical supply and forcing the ship's damage control system into immediate action. Enemy 08 had finally disappeared, but only after reaching its target, and the attack was still not over. The 5th Palianytsia, the only surviving UAV from the original opening layer, came in from another direction. In the simulated scenario, the UAV struck the frigate Admiral-class. Its roughly 220-pound warhead detonated at the point of impact, damaging the deck area, cable routes, and nearby technical systems while also starting a secondary fire. The 2 most dangerous high-speed targets had finally disappeared from the screen, but 3 FP-1s were still left. One was torn apart by AK-630M fire just before reaching the pier area. The final 2 split far enough apart that point defense could not engage both at the same time. In the simulated outcome, one FP-1 struck a large landing ship while the other slipped through a brief firing window and slammed into a corvette anchored nearby. In only the final minutes, 4 Russian warships were hit in the scenario: Admiral-class, Admiral Makarov, a large landing ship, and a corvette. The greater danger lay in the fact that the strikes occurred almost simultaneously. Multiple ships had to activate damage control. Shore-based firefighting forces were split between several locations while smoke began spreading across the anchorage and reducing visibility. Even the ships that had not been hit shifted into emergency status. The radars kept scanning because no one knew whether the Palianytsia Flamingo FP-1 package had been the entire attack or not. In the end, what penetrated Novorossiysk was not speed, warhead size, or numbers taken separately, but the cumulative pressure of multiple layers of targets appearing at exactly the right moment, forcing the same air defense network to deal with too many threats in too short a period of time. As the first smoke columns rose from the harbor area, Russian radars kept turning. The battle in the harbor may have temporarily ended, but no one was willing to assume that another wave would not appear. If you followed all the way to this point, let me know in the comments. In your opinion, what was the most decisive element of this plan? The speed of the Palianytsia, the destructive power of the Flamingo, or the number of FP-1s used to stretch Russian air defenses? If you want to continue following military tactical analyses like this, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. And most importantly, let us hope the war ends soon and peace can return to Ukraine.